To the Popcorn Forum panel. I am Virginia Johnson, head of English, foreign languages, and a bunch of other departments here on campus, and I'm very happy to see you all here. Our panel this afternoon is convened to discuss the issue, the historical quest for understanding and interacting with nature. And I would like to introduce to you our panel of distinguished people who are themselves strong advocates for and students of nature. I will introduce all of them in the order in which they will speak. Each of them has approximately 6 or 7 minutes, and then we'll have a response from our keynote speaker today, and that will be followed by a question period from you, the audience. The first person I'd like to introduce to you is David Douglas, who is here with his friend Billy. David Douglas is portrayed by Bob Murray, who is head of the Division of Natural Sciences and Math here at NIC. David Douglas was born in Scotland in 1798. He died in 1834. He was also known as Don David El Botanico, the fireman, and the grass man, which he will explain to you. David Douglas is known as the plant collector of the Pacific Northwest. He is most famous for introducing many plant specimens into domestication, having sent seed from the United States to many European horticultural societies. Mr. Douglas died a literally gory death. He was studying in Hawaii, and there was a big pit that had been dug to round up bulls into. He also had a mysterious death. It is surmised that he either jumped, was pushed, or fell into the bull pit and was gored to death. Our second speaker today will be John Muir. John is portrayed by Tim Christie, who is a speech instructor here at North Idaho College. John Muir was also born in Scotland, another Scot. He was born in 1838, died in 1914. John Muir was the pioneer of the conservation movement in the United States and founder of the Sierra Club. His slim build may be attributed to the fact that he subsisted many, many months, even on icebergs and on glaciers, by eating only hardtack and drinking tea. He died of pneumonia. Our third speaker is Herman Melville, portrayed by Chad Klinger, English instructor at North Idaho College, on my immediate left here. Hermie, as I have come to know him in a fond way, was born in the United States. He also has Scotch in his blood. He is of Dutch-Scotch heritage, born in 1819, died in 1891. He is probably most well known as the author of Moby Dick, that enormous novel which many of us were required to but did not actually read in high school or college. Many critics consider Moby Dick to be the great American novel. In this novel, Herman Melville captures the 19th century American attitude toward nature, which is use it up as fast as you can, be greedy, be rapacious, but it also captures that 19th century worldwide quest, the romantic one, for a deep understanding of nature. Next, I would like to introduce our Norwegian guest, Thor Heyerdahl, in the shorts. Thor Heyerdahl was born in Norway in 1914, and he is still living. Heyerdahl is probably best known for his book Kon-Tiki, which was named after the raft which he built to sail from Peru to Easter Island. He surmised as a young anthropologist that the similarities between petroglyphs and statues in Peru and on Easter Island were not mere happenstance. And he set out to prove that people could travel on a raft using only natural materials and the force of nature, the wind, to make that long journey in the Pacific Ocean. And Thor is here with us today to tell us about his life following that exploration. I next would like to introduce Edward Abbey, born in 1927, died in 1989. While our other guests have been known as Scots, he might be best known as Scotch and Soda, for Edward had a small drinking problem. He is portrayed by Dale Marcy, as I said, who teaches chemistry and environmental science here at North Idaho College. Ed Abbey is probably best known for his famous books, The Monkey Wrench Gang and Desert Solitaire. His motivational writings, in fact, inspired the Earth First and other eco-terrorist groups. Ed himself has called himself Appalachian white trash. That class act will be followed by Lady Jane Goodall, portrayed here by Anne Solomon, who is a local attorney. Jane Goodall was born in 1934 and, as you know, is still living and doing her research. Lady Goodall is an Englishwoman. From the age of 5, she was very interested in nature and in observing natural phenomenon. She will describe to you, I believe, how her mother found her one day when she was 5 years old from her explorations. At age 23, Jane Goodall decided that she wanted to go to Africa, no matter what. And so she followed Louis Leakey there, introduced herself, became his typist, and the rest, as they say, is history, simian history. Our final speaker today, you may have already met, that is John Wesley Powell, portrayed by Dr. Clay Jenkinson, and he will be responding after our speakers do their introductions of themselves to you. So we'll begin with you, David.
Come on, Billy, let's rest for just a minute. 10 years have taken their toll on my 36-year-old body. Walked over 10,000 miles, fallen in the Fraser River, fallen in the Columbia River. It's just not what it used to be. But we can sit here and we can enjoy all this beauty. You know, we're going to spend Christmas in Hawaii. That will be something new for us. I'm sure we'll find it really great and exciting. It has to be a really barren place where there's no blade of grass, no bird, no rock, which I will find extremely exciting. So let's just sit and rest. We're here at Spokane House. We've been very lucky to have been sponsored by the London Horticultural Society and by the Hudson's Bay Company. They have financed our travels. They've given us our food. They've let us roam over the Pacific Northwest. So let's just sit for a second. You know, I really think this has been a bad winter here. I had hoped to collect some camas, and I notice it's not out yet. Several years ago, I had the privilege of having a nice camas meal with the Chinooks. It tasted sort of like baked pears. Really very, very good, and I really hope to collect some, even though it does have the bad after effects of flatulence. And many times we were driven out of the Chinook Lodge after dinner. The Chinooks really wanted me to be one of their white son-in-laws. In fact, the chief thought it would be a great prestige for him, for me to be his son-in-law. He even built me a privacy cabin inside his lodge. Being an English gentleman, we won't discuss what went on in the lodge, but he did give me every hospitality that was known at the time. I just did not feel like to be tied down to his daughter. I mean, there's plants out there. There's trees out there. We need to botanize this area. I still remember April 7th, 1825. We sailed up to Columbia to Fort Astoria. Only 8 months, 14 days from London to Astoria, record time. They were in the process of closing Fort Astoria and moving it up to Vancouver, a new fort, Fort Vancouver, and the trip up the river was absolutely marvelous. I can hardly wait to get on the ground and botanize. There are plants out there. There are plants no one has ever seen out there before. They're really great. Lewis and Clark made a lot of them famous, and I want to send them back to London. I want people to be able to raise them in their gardens. First 9 months here, I walked 2,000 miles over the Columbia. The next year, I walked 4,000 miles. That's on foot. Good sandals, good tough clothes. Life in Fort Vancouver is extremely comfortable. Very nice. Everyone there practically was Scot or of Scottish descent. Yeah, it was really nice. The English have had the Irish to fight their wars and the Scots to build their empires. They've been very clever. They stayed home, reaped all the profits of our sweat and toil. But there's still plants out there to collect. Lots of plants to collect. The grasses in the valleys along the Columbia were absolutely astounding. More grasses than I knew about. A lot of the Indian scouts called me the grass man. and others behind my back called me Olapiska, which meant the fireman, because I liked to drink hot tea and smoke my pipe as often as I could. So they thought that was really neat. Here comes Grassman, here comes the fireman. I collected a lot of plants and sent back. Didn't want to get rich, just wanted to find and collect plants. Probably the most famous was the red flowery quince that I sent back. Very popular on the English estates. But I also sent back a lot of conifers, the white pine, the ponderosa pine, the grand fir, the noble fir, and of course we can't forget the Douglas fir. Douglas fir, named for me. Created great country estates for English gentry. Made beautiful man-made parks, the kind that you and I see every day as we sit here at Spokane. I can probably safely say I'm the world's foremost plant collector. I've collected more specimens than just about anyone else. I returned to London in 1827. You remember that when we got back to London. I was the toast of society. I was made a member of the Linnaean Society, the Geological Society, the Horticultural Society, and I was a member of society. I ate in the best dining rooms with the most beautiful ladies and the most learned men of the day. I was also paid gardener's wages. We returned in 1830 to Fort Vancouver. Dr. McLaughlin gave me a room in his home, gave me a manservant, but there are plants in California to be collected, and we were soon on our way to Monterey, and soon on our way on down to Santa Barbara. Plants, lots and lots and lots of plants. One of the most exciting ones to find was the sugar pine. I had been looking for it for years. I'd seen these big cones. I'd seen these big seeds. Indians carried around. Great tree. I found them in the Willamette Valley. I was shooting cones out of the top of a tree when some Indians surprised me. I tried to let them know I'm shooting cones out of the tree, and I sort of pointed my gun at them, and they disappeared into the woods. Well, Billy and I got out of there mighty fast. We walked until nighttime, and I slept that night without a fire and out without hot tea, because I was sure they were back to get both of us. You'd make a nice cap. You know, we got out of there really fast. When we hit Monterey and we went on to Santa Barbara, the Hartels, who were my hosts, and the fathers at the missions called me Don David Albonico. This is the closest I'm going to get to be titled gentry. I know it's going to be the closest because I'm still paid just gardener's wages. Well, Billy, we've sent a lot of seeds back. We're responsible for annuals that a lot of people plant in their yards today, or these mass plantings, but we've got a long walk from Fort Spokane to go back to Fort Vancouver, and then we have to catch a ship to San Francisco, and from San Francisco on to Hawaii. But I promise, we will have Christmas dinner in Hawaii. We will have Christmas dinner. And here, I've got a little bit of dried salmon for you. Come on. Let's be on our way. Here's your salmon. It's really quite good. Come on.
John Muir.
It's quite amazing to me that we're here today talking about understanding nature and the intricacy of nature, and we're in a stuffy room. I do not quite understand why we're not outside enjoying the splendor of nature, especially on such a beautiful day as this, and perhaps we would better understand nature if we spent more time outside than we did inside. For those of you who know anything about me, you'll notice that I am dressed in quite an unusual attire. I like to spend my time in nature, and being in these particular clothes is somewhat uncomfortable for me. However, what I have learned is that for us to be able to have an impact on protecting nature, you sometimes have to do things that are not necessarily comfortable, as is the case of me wearing these particular clothes. I would much rather be wearing a pair of hardy trousers and a good wool shirt and a pair of chink boots and spending my time out in the great outdoors as well. We should be there today. But since I am here and dressed as I am, I would like to discuss some of my perspectives on understanding and appreciating this world we call the wild America. My knowledge comes from being a mountain climber, an explorer, a geologist, a botanist, and a writer. As I was introduced, some people even suggest that I'm the pioneer of conservation. Since my birth, I suspect one of my greatest assets was my sense of curiosity. As a young child in Dunbar, Scotland, I was always fascinated by the things outside of the house rather than inside the house. Even as a wee lad of 11 years of age, when I went to America, we immigrated to America, I was absolutely fascinated by our trip. Despite the fact that we spent 3 months in the Atlantic Ocean on the ship, enduring great hardship, the stench of the ship was appalling. I suffered dehydration as well as a bad case of seasickness most of the time. I found the trip to be absolutely fascinating in that I was intrigued by why the sails worked that they did, as well as the the dolphins swimming on the green sea. One of my most vivid memories of that particular trip is looking in the eye of a whale as it swam by our ship. When we landed in America, my parents and I settled in Wisconsin, and we cleared off a farm. And I worked there until I was the age of 22, and then I went off to school and to make my way in the world. I went to the University of Wisconsin and spent about 2.5 years there, and then I went into to work in a carriage shop. At that point in my life, I had perhaps one of the most profound experiences that I've ever had. And that was that I was working on a carriage, and a metal staple, flew up into my right eye and pierced my right eye. I was so alarmed, I ran to the window, and I could feel the fluid from my eye flowing down my cheek. And I ran to the window in horror to discover that I was blind in that eye. The trauma of that was so severe that my other eye failed as well. And I literally spent the next 2.5 to 3 weeks lying in a dark room with bandages on my eye. But the miracle occurred, and my sight was regained, and I made a resolution at that point in time that I would spend the rest of my life discovering wild America. I began a 1,000-mile journey to Florida, and then on to Cuba, and then went through the Panama Canal, and ended up in San Francisco, where I became a sheep herder in the high country of Yosemite. There I spent 7 years, and my curiosity and my sense of appreciation for the high country and the world around me made me understand many things that other people had not understood. For example, the origin of Yosemite. Many people thought the origin came from a cataclysmic event, most likely an earthquake, but it was my theory that the Yosemite country was developed by a glacier, and later it was proved that I was correct. If I am able to provide a particular perspective on the world at large and nature in particular, it would be that everything in nature has its place, and it is all tied together. Every plant, every rock, every animal is linked with one another, and if we affect one of those, everything else in the universe is affected as well. In terms of this perspective, I was instrumental in founding the Sierra Club in 1892, and That came about because I observed the degradation of the environment. In the mere short 7 years that I was in the Yosemite country, I saw the greed that was occurring in our national forests and in other areas, and I was instrumental in being able to work with Presidents Roosevelt, Presidents Wilson and Taft to designate over 50 national parks, 200 national monuments, and 150 million acres of national forest lands, protecting this land so everybody can appreciate the natural world. Perhaps I put it best when I wrote in my second book, Our National Parks, published in 1901. And I'd like to read from that book for you. And this deals with the appreciation of nature and the need for people to appreciate nature. The tendency nowadays is to wander in wilderness is a delightful one to see. Thousands of tired, nerve-shaken, over-civilized people are beginning to find out that going to the mountains is going home, that wilderness is a necessity, and that mountain parks and reservations are useful not only as fountains of timber and irrigating rivers, but as fountains of life. Awakening from the stupefying effects of the vice of over-industry and the deadly apathy of luxury, they are trying as best they can to mix and enrich their little goings-on with those of nature. And so to get rid of rust and disease, we briskly venture and roam, and some of us are trying to wash off the sins and cobwebs and cares of the devil's spinning in an all-day mountain storm, or sauntering in rosy pine woods or in a gentilean meadow, brushing through chaparral, bending down and parting sweet flowery sprays, tracing rivers to their sources, getting in touch with the nerves of Mother Earth, panting in whole-souled exercise and rejoicing in deep, long-drawn breaths of pure wildness. This is a fine and natural and full of promise. So it is also growing interest in the care and preservation of the forests and wild places in general, and in even the half-wild parks and gardens and towns. Even the scenery habitat in its most artificial forms, mixed with spectacles, silliness, and even Kodak cameras, its devotees arrayed more gorgeously than scarlet tanagers, frightening even wild game with red umbrellas. Even this is encouraging and may well be regarded as a hopeful sign of the times that people are beginning to appreciate the wild country. Fundamentally, being in nature is required to appreciate the intricacies of the natural world. It comes from experiencing and living in the natural world away from the trappings of civilized world. To put it in as simple as terms as I can, the clearest way into the universe is through a forest wilderness.
My name is Herman Melville. I was quite astounded just recently to hear from our moderator of the apparent reputation of my sixth book, Moby Dick. I stand before you as a man in his 50s, let us say in mid-1870s, not long after Mr. Powell here has thrilled us all with reports of his trip down the Colorado River. And I can attest that in the quarter century since Moby Dick was published, when I was but 31, that fewer than 1,000 copies of that book have been sold. And I can pretty well bet that none of my contemporaries, such as Mr. Powell, have ever heard of the book, much less read it. I'm now confronted with perhaps the horrifying notion that schoolboys and schoolgirls are perhaps required to read what my contemporaries wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. Such is history. It is nonetheless that book which brings me here and to this panel, because it is in that work, of all the things that I wrote, that I most explicitly attempt to articulate my understanding of the natural world, or at least my responses to the natural world. And if it's a big book, it's because I take the time to review the understandings of so many who have gone before me. Among other things, Moby Dick is a natural history, and I would like to feel that its chapters on taxonomy and anatomy are at least respectable in the eyes of the scientific community. Because, like the 5 books that preceded it, it is based on experiences that I had largely before the age of 25. I would like to take the time to briefly review my life up to that point. I was born in New York City in 1819, a city of roughly 130,000, which had recently outstripped Boston and Philadelphia as the major center of shipping and commerce in this country. My mother was descended from a long line of Dutch who had settled New Amsterdam centuries before. Presently, I work as a United States Customs Officer on Gansevoort Street in Lower New York, Gansevoort being my mother's maiden name and the name of one of her ancestors who was a hero during the American Revolution. My father, Allen Melville, was a Scot who could trace his lineage back to a line of kings. He was a prosperous merchant, importer, and much of my family, cousins, uncles, etc., were dynamic men, some of whom owned and operated clipper ships, went back and forth across the Atlantic. And I enjoyed the stimulation and education of the world in which I lived. By the time I was a teen, however, my family had fallen upon hard times, a series of economic depressions culminating in the Great Depression, or the Great Economic Panic of 1837, in part caused by the Great Fire of 1835 in New York, which destroyed so many banks and businesses and financial records. My family was on the point of bankruptcy. At the age of 18, I spent considerable time searching for rewarding employment. I tried school teaching several times, which was not rewarding in any sense. One school, in fact, closed its doors before they ever paid me. I also sought work on the Erie Canal to no avail. An opportunity presented itself in 1839. I was able to sign on in the capacity of boy on a packet ship bound for Liverpool. And that voyage, that journey, afforded me enough experience for 2 books 6 or 7 years later in my life, Redburn and White Jacket. I came back from that experience to find that my family's fortunes had only grown worse. And again, the economic situation held no more prospects for me, so I took it into my head to go on a whaling voyage, my mind being inflamed by some tales of a cousin of mine who had done that a few years earlier. So in November of 1840, I found myself in New Bedford, Massachusetts, enlisted aboard a brand new whaler, the Acushnet, and by Christmas I was embarked on a 4-year odyssey that would furnish the material for my subsequent career as a writer. The Acushnet took me to the South Atlantic around Cape Horn, up the coast of Peru, through the Galapagos Islands, where we spent several weeks taking on fresh water and fresh turtle meat. I was later to write about the Encantados, as they are known in Spanish, not so notably as Charles Darwin, whose first voyage or visit to the Galapagos preceded mine by some 6 years. Of that, of course, I knew nothing at the time. Eventually, we reached the equatorial whaling grounds of the Pacific. By the time we entered the port of Nukuhiva in the Marquesas Islands, surrounded by French warships that were exercising sovereignty over those islands at that point, I had grown somewhat disenchanted with life aboard a whaler and seeking more adventure of the kind that my cousin had told me about. I persuaded a shipmate of mine, Toby Green, to jump ship with me, and so we deserted, climbed across several mountain ridges to a remote valley inhabited by a tribe reputed to be cannibals, known as the Taipei. We spent some 3 weeks with them, and whether or not they eyed us as tasty morsels or not, I'm not sure, but in any event, we were, after 3 weeks or so, one might say, rescued by an Australian bark, the Lucian, and so I was once again a-whaling. By the time we reached Tahiti, the owners of that ship relieved the captain of command and replaced him with the first mate, a brutal man whom some 15 other members of the crew and I refused to serve under, and so we were arrested and incarcerated in a crude hut and in Papeete for a time. Once the ship departed, we were released, and I spent the next 6 months or so as what the Tahitians call an omo'o, a beachcomber, or perhaps a beach bum. I worked odd jobs at various plantations and more or less lived the good life in paradise. By 1842, I began to think of returning home, and when a Nantucket whaler came by, named the Charles and Henry, I agreed to serve. And it in turn agreed to discharge me at Honolulu when it reached the Sandwich Islands. In Honolulu, I spent another 4 months, and during a time of political upheavals involving various power plays between the British and Americans for control of the local kingdom under King Kamehameha at that time. Eventually, I shipped aboard the U.S. frigate, the United States, where I learned the realities of military service aboard a naval vessel. I think there were at least 19 separate behaviors that explicitly were to meet with the penalty of death. And for virtually anything else one did, one got a public flogging. I became a keen student of how to avoid the lash, and I also made a fast friend with another shipmate with even more literary taste than I, and I became a voracious reader and student of literature with him on that voyage. Finally, by about October 1844, the United States docked in Boston, and I returned to the life I had known. And within a year, I had written a book about my experience among the Taipei cannibals in the Marquesas, and was instantly famous as a best-selling author. That I followed with several other books of that sort. However, by the time I started writing Marty, Moby Dick, and Pierre, I found that I had either outstripped the literary market or lost my marbles. In any event, my interaction with nature during this 4-year odyssey ranged from participation in the systematic slaughter and butchery of some of nature's most prodigious species to more sublimely mystical, transcendental moments swaying in the rigging above a wide blue Pacific Ocean. But whether slicing and dicing or rhapsodizing romantically, I brought a sense of wonder to all that I beheld. As for my quest for an understanding of nature, it has been, of course, a quest for metaphysical understanding of the supernatural, the physical world being to me and to most of my contemporaries a great sphinx riddled with riddles, teeming with circumstances and phenomena that ostensibly mirror the metaphysical truths about its inmost core and our inmost selves. When my character Ahab declares that not the smallest atom stirs or lives in matter, but has its cunning duplicate in mind, he echoes not only Plato, but virtually all the great thinkers and writers of the age in which I live, from Goethe, Rousseau, and Carlyle abroad, to Emerson and Alcott in my own backyard, all of whom see in the natural world correspondences to what surely must be the great principles of the spiritual vitality that animates the physical world. In short, I was trained by the age in which I lived to look into nature in order to discover the face of God. The difference between myself and, say, my American transcendentalist brethren is that while they tend to see nature as manifesting signs of an all-embracing universal harmony, fostered perhaps by a kind of democratic God, I have often found nature more disturbing than reassuring. I'm by no means immune to the beauty of tropical breezes wafting across a sleepy blue ocean. It was always the horrors of what lay beneath the surface that engaged my imagination. I'm too much the inheritor of Calvinist Protestantism not to suspect that the natural world is often a reflection of the worst in ourselves, and not to see it as a deceitful arena filled with snares and pitfalls, not only to our physical well-being, but to our very souls, especially for the young, unwary idealist who seeks in its very beauty for transcendence of life's harsher realities. In Polynesia, I have observed the notion, so I've as for the notion of man somehow being able once again to live in a state of harmony with nature, in Polynesia I've observed Rousseau's Noble Savage, and while I hardly found the natives of the Marquesas, Tahiti, and the Sandwich Islands to be more savage than some of the men with whom I shipped or encountered on the streets of Liverpool, I nevertheless found nothing in them that I would regard as noble. They lived unexamined lives, and I agree with Socrates that the unexamined life is not worth living. And anyone who has watched, as I have, in the torchlights of a whaling vessel, sharks feeding on the carcass of a whale at midnight in such numbers that the world seemed a big cheese and the sharks the maggots in it, and has watched his shipmates gorge themselves on whale brains in the same lurid glow of those torches, might well question first the nature of the God that made that shark, and second, the line that separates sharks from men, if such a line there be. But it is not Calvinism that haunts me, nor even Thomas Hobbes, whose own Leviathan paints such a dark picture of nature and human nature, so much as something else, which some perhaps might call modern. You may indeed call me Ishmael, for it is in this character in Moby Dick that I best express my own inner misgivings about the nature of the world we live in. Two minutes? Oh, I have to just one page? Okay.
Thank you. Thor Heyerdahl will now speak to us.
Thank you very much. My name is Thor Heyerdahl. I'm from Norway. I was born in 1914. I'm approximately 83 years old today. I'm well preserved, as I'm sure you all have noticed already as I stand here before you. I'm a trained zoologist. I came today because I was intrigued to be with John Wesley Powell in the study of nature. And one of the points, if you heard John speak this morning, is he had to actually do something to prove his scientific thought. He had to prove to people his belief and go down the river. I myself was intrigued through my studies in the peopling, if you would, of the Polynesian islands, the Marquesas and so forth, as you just heard. It was often thought that all those islands in the South Pacific were populated with people from Asia and so forth. That was not my belief. I was born in 1914. I was a trained zoologist, lived all my life in Norway, so forth. But I was always intrigued by Polynesia. Perhaps it was living near the Arctic Circle that made me so interested in that area of the world, because I wanted to get the hell out of the cold. So I headed that way with my wife. On our honeymoon, we went down and we were collecting insects, we were collecting plant life, and so forth, and we were sitting on the beach one night and listening to the waves, and there was a local man that came to join us as we sat on the beach. His name was Te Tatua. And Tay was sitting on the beach with us and was telling us stories of ancient Polynesia and of the mystery men that had come to his island in ancient times. And they called them the mystery white men that came to the islands there and populated them. And as we listened to him, we started thinking about where did these people come from? Asian descent would not work. How would that work? My wife and I talked about that as we went to bed that night and sat there listening to the waves. My wife said, it's incredible on this island how the waves keep crashing in from the east and crashing in from the east, and yet I go to the west and the waves are not there. We sat there and listened to the wind coming through the palms from the east. We looked at the plants and noticed how all the branches were bent to the west and so forth. And that night was the night that it came to me, the Asians never populated this area. These people came from the Americas. These people came from North America. These people came from South America. And from hence, that's where the population came from. That's where I decided that night to pursue this thought. I went back to Norway and then spoke with other scholars who immediately thought that I was, of course, ill-informed and a bit crazy. I then was going to have to prove myself to these people that it was indeed possible in ancient times to cross the Pacific Ocean from Peru and Ecuador, come across to the islands and to be populated there. I called 6 of my friends who I'd met in World War II. We were all Air Force people in World War II, and said, I want to go down and I want to build a balsa wood raft. I want to lash it together with hemp rods and so forth, and I want to go across the Pacific Ocean. Would you join me? All 6 said, absolutely. And we set off on our way. We flew to Ecuador, went up the rivers. We hand cut down balsa wood logs, as big as we could find them, 50 feet long, 3 feet across, floated them down 2 rivers down to the harbor where we lashed them together. The first ones ran fore and aft on our ship, and then cross members, and then last members on top again, all lashed together with hemp ropes. We put on 1 major sail so we could run downwind only with it. We built a bamboo shelter on top of this raft. We did cheat, if you would, and put some radio equipment on it in case that we were to sink out there. And off we went. Off we took. We spent 101 days at sea crossing the Pacific Ocean. We went 4,300 nautical miles. Our average speed, we went 42.5 miles a day on the average. Our biggest day was 71 miles. Downwind, down current the entire time. We had vegetables with us. We had fresh water with us. We had cooking utensils. We had a Primus stove, if you know what those are, that burn white gas, so we could cook on board and so forth like that. We caught fish. The most abundant type of fish that we caught to eat were flying fish, because we'd wake up every morning, pick them off the deck, and proceed to cook them. As a matter of fact, one of my crew, Torgstein, we would dip him over head first over the side of the boat to check on our lashings. We could see the lashings on the deck to see how they were holding up. We could not see underneath the boat, of course, to see how they're holding up under the water. Torstein said he could hold his breath the longest, so we held him under the water by his ankles so he could check our lashings underneath. Right? One time we were doing that, and a shark came up with great interest in Torgstein while he was down there. If you know anything about a shark, if you get a shark's tail up above its fins, it is useless. It then begins to start drowning, above its gills, I should say, begins to start drowning and does not fight back at all. So we ate lots of shark meat. Torgstein was upset when he saw the shark next to him, but once we got it on board, he was much more relaxed. On our 101 days, the other one thing I wanted to mention to you about, the design of the raft ended up being impeccable in that the main logs were running fore and aft now. And if you've ever gone downwind in any kind of sailing vessel at all, it's called a following sea. And that you can't really keep up with the waves as they're going. They kind of pick you up and push you down, right? The waves come from behind you. Imagine now this is an open raft as you're sitting there. These waves are crashing over the stern of this boat the whole time. We would trade off every 4 hours, somebody else on the tiller steering the boat, and you had to fight the tiller all the time with 3 to 4 foot waves coming over your shoulders the entire time. These waves would come onto the boat, and the waves would then disappear because it was just a raft lashed together. And it ended up being an incredible design because the water left the whole time and washed through the logs. It took us approximately 99 days until we saw land. We saw land. The first island that we came to was Angatau. We saw it. We were thrilled. We came washing in. Natives came out in canoes. They saw our sails. They came out. We put up flags announcing that we were arriving. Natives came out to help us. We asked them not to touch the boat because, again, we wanted to be true to our science and we wanted to land the ship by ourselves. Unfortunately for us, we got within 2 miles. And the currents changed, the wind changed, and we missed the island. And we had no motors. We had nothing else. We were like the native people. Off we went. We missed the island. 2 days later, we came to Puka Puka. And again, came within about 1.5 miles, and it too disappeared off the starboard bow of our raft as we went on. We finally ended up, just 1 more day later, coming to Roriya in the Marquesas Islands. Roriya is surrounded by a reef. And these other two islands were not. We saw that we could see sandy beach, we could see people on the shore. These are uninhabited islands surrounded by a reef. Poor Kon-Tiki was then smashed upon the reef. It took the boat never was broken apart though. We crashed onto the reef. The reef was about, the water above the reef, I should say, was about 6 feet deep, so the boat was caught, but not just smashed directly on rocks. We had lift and smash and lift and smash. We had picked up a rubber raft along the way that we had found floating free in the ocean. We pumped that back up and started putting equipment on that and ferrying that into the island. And we got onto the island and got our gear in there and had a hand-cranked radio and cranked the radio up to let our family members and so forth know that we had made our trip successfully. I still had to argue very much with the scientific community. They said just because you had a folly across the Pacific Ocean does not mean that you have proven scientifically that people could travel such distances. That was 1947 that I did the Kon-Tiki. I went back out in 1969 in Ra and built another one. I had set out on a 4,000-mile trip across the southern Atlantic Ocean. Ra, I was going to go from Africa to South America. Ra made it 2,700 miles of those 4,000 miles before she fell apart and sank. I then went back and built Ra 2 in 1970, the next year, left Morocco, went to Barbados. It took me and my crew 57 days to cross the Atlantic Ocean there. No screws, no nails, no metal, all natural materials that we found there. And then in 1977, I built the Tigris, and it was a reed ship, and I sailed from Morocco to Oman. Thereby, in my mind, without any doubt, proving to my skeptics that indeed, with the power of the currents and the power of the wind, that you can build natural-made sailing ships and cross the largest oceans and the largest obstacles that we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Ed Abbey this afternoon. I agree. It's very nice to be here, but I'd rather be outdoors. I started out my life in Appalachia. My father was a Puritan. My mother was hardworking. I decided I had to get away from that as quickly as I could, so I ran away when I was in junior high school and went to the West because I heard that's where the future was, and I found out it wasn't for me because there's not much you can do when you're too young to work. So I ended up back home after hitchhiking and a bus ride, but it did intrigue me, the vastness of the West. So after I grew up, did a stint in the military, I decided I would like to go back to the West to go to college. GI Bill allowed me to attend the University of New Mexico, and so I got my first degree in English in 1951 and a second degree in 1956 in philosophy, which allowed me to go to work at a college and talk for a living. And so I proceeded to do that off and on, depending upon my moods, for the rest of my life. All I really wanted to do as a man was to write. I wanted to be a well-known writer. I wanted to gain notoriety. I wanted to have an audience, but I wanted them to stay away from me. I never did well in groups like this. I always tended to annoy my audience. It helped keep them away from me. Who are you? Please sit down. As I was saying, well, really, normally I don't drink this way. Normally I would have whiskey, but I'm on my best behavior this afternoon, so I'm just having a beer. It will keep me a little more loose as I give my talk. I did become a writer. I wrote 21 books during my life. There were some fiction and some nonfiction. Probably the ones I enjoyed the most were writing the fiction books. Most of the American populace didn't notice them, so I earned a meager existence writing some nonfiction. Probably the first one that the public noticed was one I wrote about a stay at the Arches National Monument. It became Arches National Park, and I prostituted myself to the federal government as a park ranger. I didn't really like the job, but I got to wear a very nice uniform. They gave me a gun, and so I got to go around and harass the hippies that came out there to camp. And it was a real tidy life. I spent most of my time alone, and I really enjoyed the solitude. At the completion of that, within the next couple years, I wrote my first non-fiction book that sold well. It was called Desert Solitaire. It was about my stay and about the joys of being alone. There's only one thing better than solitude, and that's society, and vice versa. I really enjoy the solitude, but I also really enjoy society. Society has several very useful things. One, of course, is bourbon. Another is women. I really enjoyed my women. Some people said too often, but I don't know how that could be. See, I was married a couple of times when I was young. I seemed to have poor taste in women. I liked the great outdoors. I seemed to pick women who didn't. So they would stay in the city, and I would go to the country. Well, some women like coming to the country, and so that tends to make it so marriages don't last very well. But that's the way it goes. But I did enjoy my time in society, and I was quite productive at some work that I had done. Also, because of my life in society, I worked as a social worker. I made enough money that I could then go back and subsist out in nature. I did about 17 years of subsisting in nature, and while I was there, I did a lot of writing. I figured it was one of the things I needed to do as a writer was to hide and do my writing. So I wrote books about things that I did. And when you're in nature, what you do is nature. So I wrote about my travels. And when I started writing fiction books, I wrote about what I felt about nature. My stay at Arches National Monument taught me that things were all wrong in the park system, that we needed to overhaul the park system. So I wrote up a recipe for that. First, you don't allow cars in the park system. Second, you don't allow any more roads in the park system. And third, you put the park rangers back to work. Don't have them be statisticians. Don't have them be hanging around, selling tickets. My goodness, have them out doing what they're trained to do, which is helping people enjoy nature. Of course, nobody would believe me, and it wasn't until I hear nowadays that there are some changes going on in the parks, so I'm rather smug that I was right. The way to protect our parks is to protect them from the people who go to visit and overuse them. So, other things that I wrote about were my beliefs, and I really hate to admit this, but my most successful book was one about anarchy. It was called The Monkey Wrench Gang, and I wrote it because I was very distressed with what had been going on in the natural world in the West. I love the West. I love the great southwestern desert, and the bureaucrats of the power structure of America were capitalizing on the resources, and I couldn't tolerate that. So I wrote this book that said you don't have to just roll over and take it, you can take it to them. And so monkey wrenching was invented. How to attack the equipment when no one's around. How to make it so it is unprofitable to extract resources from the West. Well, people seem to like that. I developed quite a following. The Earth First people took up my cause as their banner. I guess that was all right, but I just hated to have people following me. But it really was useful that I had this following because it pissed off all the conservatives. I took on mining, said that you can't extract minerals. I took on ranching, and that's really got a bunch of the West, that you can't fleece off the land. You should pay a fair amount of money to graze the West. I took on the timber industry, said you just can't have your forest for fiber. Well, needless to say, I had a lot of enemies there. That was okay, I don't like people anyway. Well, but I had these following, these Earth First folks, all the hippies, these people, long hair, hanging around, And actually, I didn't care much for them either, so I had to do something to annoy them. So I took on immigration. I really don't like those people coming from the South, so I wrote some essays about immigration. I wrote some essays about feminism. I wrote some essays about population control. Yep, sure enough, pissed off the liberals too. So I really rounded out my repertoire. So as my career went on, I found out that I had just about isolated everybody. Well, all life is not enjoyment. I found out in 1982 that I had 6 months to live. That was a shock. I had lived a good life. I figured I had done as much as I could possibly do in life, but still, 6 months? There were a lot of women I hadn't met yet. So I figured, how could they be spared? What could I do? Well, it really wasn't an overwhelming thing to me. The first thought that came to my mind is, well, at least I won't have to floss my teeth anymore. 6 years later, as I was still up and about, annoying people around me, I wrote in one of my books, Only One Life Please, that if I had not offended everyone, I apologize, because I had tried to get around to each and every person. I continued to write books about travel and to write books about the environment. One of my books was entitled A Fool's Progress. The critics said that it was as close as I ever wrote as far as an autobiography. That did make me wonder, because I wrote it from the perspective of a racist, sexist, sick man on his way back to his roots. I thought, well, I guess recognition, and that's the way it went. So pretty soon I figured out that I really was going to die. My chronic pancreatic disease, I don't know why I had that. But for some reason my digestive tract was not doing well, and I figured out I was going to die, and I decided that I really did believe in reincarnation. And my friends suggested things like the falcon or the eagle, but I decided I'd much rather be the turkey buzzard. And so I figure right now that I am reincarnated, and I'm floating around the deserts, riding the thermals above the landform, looking down, being able to stare at the goings-on from a very high altitude, and not caring one bit. Thank you.
Thank you. Your annoyance was very clear. Lady Goodall.
Good afternoon, everyone. In Africa, I would say jambo, and if I were talking in the language of my beloved chimpanzees, I would say ho, 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 ho. When they're excited, that is how they greet one another. I have always loved animals. When I was 5, my mother couldn't find me for hours and send out the constables. And some hours later, I walked across the field with hay in my hair, and I had been studying, lying on my back, how chickens lay eggs. And the constable said to my mother, "You have one mad child." But I knew that I must go to Africa. I graduated from secondary school, which is high school here, and I saved my money by working as a secretary in London. And then at age 23, I paid my way to Africa, and I found Dr. Louis Leakey, whom I had read about and knew he was doing digs in Africa with his wife, Mary. And I was hired on, not by Dr. Leakey at that time, but by the Museum of Natural History in Nairobi, Kenya. And I did then work my way into a dig on the Serengeti Plain with Dr. Leakey, and at that time he started to talk to me about chimpanzees. He did not have the money at that time, but he did 2 years later get the money to send me to Tanzania to a national park called Gombe, and that is where I have spent my life since. It's hard for me to talk about myself because I'd much rather talk about chimpanzees. I love the chimpanzees. Some people say that I love them more than I love my fellow human beings. And in some ways I do. They are gentle. They are very smart. I was the first one to discover that they not only use tools, but they create tools. They premeditate and create tools. The first tool that I discovered that they use is, in effect, a spoon. They carve out a leaf and insert the leaf in ant hills and termite hills, pull the leaf up, and lick it off. And of course, I have tasted every ant that I have witnessed them tasting also. I feel that's been part of my job. The second tool that I have witnessed and also has been photographed that they have created is a sponge. And when there is a container such as a log and with a source of water and they can't get the log, can't lift it up, what they do is take leaves, chew the leaves, get them mushy, and then dip in like it's a sponge and then absorb the water. When I reported this to Dr. Leakey, and it was also reported in the National Geographic Society magazine, there was a lot of controversy because we decided then that we must either redefine man, human, we must redefine animal, or we must redefine tool. And that controversy is not yet resolved. For myself, I think that humans need to be much more humble. My goal now is to try not only to preserve the habitat of chimpanzees, but also to make sure that when they are kept in captivity, which is primarily zoos now and research, biomedical research, that the captivity is humane. I'm doing a pretty good job of that, I think, as far as the zoos, in that the spaces are bigger and we are providing more of a natural environment. But as far as the biomedical research, we have a long way to go. They are largely kept in 4 by 8 foot enclosed caverns, so to speak, or cages. And that is simply no life for a chimpanzee. But I understand that biomedical research is necessary, so that is my goal while I'm living, is to try to work on that. What did I learn also about chimps? Number one, I've studied them for over 3 generations. I learned that they stay in families, that they are very loving, that one of my favorites is Flo, who is here today. And Flo, I have witnessed her with 4 separate children. She bears children, as is common, about once every 5 years. The children stay with their mother even when they themselves bear children. What I did was set up, even after I got my PhD at age 31, I returned to Gombe and I set up a system which was different from any ever before set up, because I name my animals. And I name them, for example, all of Flo's children start with F. So we have Fifi and Faustino and Fabian. And then their children are also F names, so that when you record keep for future generations, you can track the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Flo. And I've done that with each of the chimps that I've studied. I am familiar with, and basically there are 60 chimps that are unafraid of me, of the 180 in Gombe. There are only 180 chimps remaining in Gombe. There are fewer than 225,000 chimps remaining in the entire world. Most of those are in Africa, except for those in zoos and used for research. But I've also learned a different... When I first got to Gombe, I thought that the chimpanzees were largely peaceful. And this was borne out by what I observed for a number of years. But I also witnessed war. There was a section of 6 chimpanzees that went south to the southern part of the park, and they were, one by one, they were murdered. And I was distraught by that for quite a while. But I learned that I need to be humble in my observations. I am not there. In fact, I don't even allow the chimps to touch me unless it's just a spontaneous gesture on the hand, because I'm trying not to get them involved with me. I am merely the observer. And all of the people that come to help me now, that is how I teach them to observe the chimpanzees. I have also witnessed cannibalism among the chimpanzees. And that's a horrifying thought, but there was one chimpanzee that I would have to say was probably mentally deranged, and she would hunt out the newborns and kill them and eat part of their brains. And this lasted for 3 years. And I did not interfere, though I was very tempted to. But that is what we have observed. That is, maybe you say, maybe part of nature, that there's the crazy ones and there's the warring ones, and then there's the wonderful mothers like Flo. I had a son. I married a National Geographic photographer that Dr. Leakey, I think I accuse him of matchmaking. He sent this photographer over, and we did fall in love, and we married. And I raised my son as I saw Flo raising her babies. I kept him as close to me as possible, while the chimpanzees cuddle their babies under their stomach, and the babies hang on. I just held my baby as much as possible on my hip, and I carried him basically 2 years. I adjusted my work schedule so that I was with him as much as possible. And the one endangerment that was there, as far as how I differ from the chimps, was that the baboons, which grown baboons like to eat baby chimps, and grown chimps like to eat, on occasion, baby baboons. And they all took an interest in the baby human. And so we did have to build a cage, a wire-enclosed cage, and my son did have to stay in there whenever I was not around, which impacted him. There was a period of time that there was an incident where he was pulled from a tree by a group of grown baboons. And I feel if I wasn't there that he would probably have died. So, and my son does not enjoy chimpanzees like I do. He has now, he's with his father. His father and I are divorced, and he is with his father, who is also in Africa, but doing moving photography of the animals in Africa on the Serengeti. As far as my perspective of humans and nature, it has been said before that we are a web, and that is my great belief. For me personally, Gombe is like heaven, and when I die, I hope I go to a place like Gombe, because you are removed. There's a sense of timelessness. There is no false pretenses, and especially with animals, I feel that I am observing them in a very realistic state. And the one thing I would hope is that we would work less toward controlling animals and more toward understanding them. Thank you.
We would now invite Mr. Powell to respond to our panel, and after that, open the floor to questions.
Thank you. I won't say much. You've been listening for a long time, so let me say a few words and then see what sorts of questions you have. I want to say a couple of general things and a couple of specific things. First of all, the most encouraging thing I've heard this afternoon is that the tradition of the scientist adventurer is still alive in America. Two of our panelists are still living, and they have distinguished themselves by not only committing themselves to the search for truth, but doing it in the field, in adventure, making life heroic and even romantic. And I think that's what science ought to be. Science is not a scholar alone in a room. Science is us engaged in the world in a profound way. And so that is a delightful prospect, to see that each of these beings spent much of his or her time outdoors in the world. Secondly, and I would urge all of you to let adventure be a part of your life. When I lost my arm at Shiloh, I could have disappeared into a room like so many Civil War veterans and moaned my life, but I couldn't do it. I wasn't going to let my armlessness stop me. And I was able to do something no human being had ever done before, to descend the Colorado River and its canyons, and to climb those sheer cliffs with one arm. And overcoming that small disability proved to be one of the most delightful parts of my whole existence, and it gave me the confidence to tell the truth about the future of the American West. So that's one general statement I wanted to make. And secondly, I want to say that although I admire Edward Abbey, at least his published work, and I admire my contemporary Mr. Muir, I disagree with what I take to be their implicit philosophy of nature. They are, I believe, preservationists, and I would call myself a conservationist. In other words, I think if I understand you correctly, Mr. Muir, you would like to lock up significant parts of the natural world against human participation and inhabitation. And I know from your admission of eco-terrorism that you would do it violently. And I disagree with both of those principles profoundly. Nature exists for human use. We stand at the top of the chain of being. There are millions and millions of people around the world who want to share the American dream. They come here in droves. Most of you are immigrants in one form or another. And we have a duty to make this world a paradise for them if we can, using rational science. The notion of locking up the West in any sense, simply because it's sublime, I believe is a travesty of human justice and social progress. And I honestly believe that any cubic inch of water which finds its way to the sea is a cubic inch of water that has been wasted. The West is arid, and to make it bloom, we must divert every molecule of that water onto the land and grow wheat with it. And terrorism, sir, is the worst possible solution to a social state, however diseased. Mr. Jefferson taught us that we have a social contract. We have all agreed to it in one form or another. And for you to suggest that there are times when violence can be used by the discontents and the malcontents and the alcoholics of our society to undercut what we have all agreed upon is the dream of humanity, to live in justice on the land, this I find, I must say, appalling. I tried to steer a middle course. The developers, the great barbecuers of the 19th century wanted to open the West to madcap exploitation. I did not. I wanted our Western development to be just and equitable and scientific on the one hand, and to prize agriculture over mining and timber extraction on the other hand. And I believe that we could find such justice if we avoided big government and big corporations and preferred locally controlled, democratic, self-contained irrigation and pasturage units instead. So it seems to me that you have despaired of the democratic process, and I never could do that as a 19th century man. Now just a couple of specific comments. What I admired so much about Thor Heyerdahl's talk and Jane Goodall's talk is the way that they showed deep respect for the world that they studied. Too many scientists come in with preconceptions. I said it's great to see a man in possession of an idea, but it is deplorable to see an idea in a possession of a man. And here we have true scientists who have begun their work by participating in the world that they wish to understand. To participate, I believe, is to know, and we cannot observe merely from the outside. I learned all of the languages of all of the Indian tribes I studied, which is why they were willing to tell me the truth about their customs and their mythology. So I greatly admired that. Herman Melville's work, I must say, I did not know, but from what you said today, I certainly do not agree with your bleak, dark view of human nature, at least until I met Mr. Abbey. But I'm a 19th century progressive, and I did not see evil in the world. I saw the gradual perfectibility of mankind. And to Mr. Douglas, let me finally say that my work was different from yours. I'm a geologist and an ethnographer. You are a botanist, but I greatly admire your long, distinguished career in providing taxonomies of the American West, and particularly bringing back the specimens to the more urban environments in America, which would lead the whole country to have a renewal of interest in nature. It's not enough just for us who are thrill seekers and who love this world of the wild scene to enjoy it. We must then take some of that quality of wildness and of grandeur and sublimity back to the more weary suburban and urban world, and we can renew it even if those people will not join us in a tree during a storm, Mr. Muir, or on top of a mast, Mr. Melville, or in a leaky raft across the seas. They're reading about it. They're seeing the artifacts that we bring back in some regards renews their lives too. And I think that's an extraordinary achievement at secondary distance. So I think I will give it to you and let people ask questions of any or all of us.
Thank you. Anyone in the audience have questions for any of our panel members? Oh, yes. How long did Billy live, Mr. Douglas?
Billy was sent back to England, and then I don't know what happened to Billy. After they found the mutilated body of Douglas, Billy was sent back to England. My guess is he was probably taken care of by William Hooker until he died a natural death. But everything sort of disappears after that.
Yes.
I want to know if your chimpanzees are sedated. I never knew that.
Are your chimpanzees sedated?
There is chimpanzee safe raisinets in the back there.
Yes, sir.
I just had to see paleontology, and they talked about a different kind of chimp, smaller one perhaps. They said that he was maybe more intelligent than the chimp, and I wonder if you could comment on that with respect to some of the new science that's using this different kind of
Any comments on a smaller kind of chimp?
I have no personal knowledge of that, but I am aware of a group of people also working to train some of the chimpanzees, and their intelligence, their language facility, their recognition of sign is astounding. And I think I myself did not believe in that when I started, or even now, because I don't want the chimpanzees to rely on me as a teacher, or even as any kind of co-equal basis. I am only an observer, but my feeling is if there's a group that starts to do that, we're going to find that they are highly educable.
Yes, sir.
Jane, why must we redefine man, animal, or tool?
Why must we redefine man, animal, or tool?
That is a very good question, and it involves spiritual, theoretical, conceptual formats or templates that, of course, is very controversial. In other words, is man the only intelligent living thing? If you define man as the only intelligent, meaning premeditation, being able to pre-think the use of a tool, then that line of reasoning says then you have to expand the definition of man, and perhaps you include the chimpanzee as a cousin. Now, I have not been involved in that argument. Dr. Leakey was more involved in that, and he was the one that promoted that. And again, it's not resolved, and I think my point of view is that I do view the chimpanzees as a cousin. You know, some people disagree with me that consider that even blasphemous, but I view that they have similar emotions: anger, jealousy, rage, warring. They have so many similar emotions that I took myself really as a relative of theirs. I viewed myself as a pale-skinned chimpanzee.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
In your lifetime, there's no knowledge or understanding of the water cycle. I'm referring to your concept of water.
During your lifetime, any knowledge of the water cycle, Mr. Powell?
Oh, yes, we understood these things very well, and I did understand that rivers would be changed forever. And one of the things that I've noticed in listening today is the sense that the progress of the world, however inevitable, brings loss with it. And so I studied the Paiute Indians because their customs, their cultures were being destroyed in my time. I floated the Colorado River, but then later planned dam sites for it. I believe we must go do reclamation, anthropology, and archaeology, and paleontology everywhere we can and study things before humans develop them too severely. Nevertheless, I am a modest advocate of human development. But it seems to me that if you want immigrants to come from Europe to the United States, or if you're even going to permit them, and they want to share the dream that the settlers of Ohio or Virginia have had, and you can divert water from stream beds onto the fields above, and some of that water returns to the stream so that it remains a living organism of some sort or other, then of course I think that irrigation is socially responsible. if the irrigation creates economic monopoly, as so often it does, or if it destabilizes the democratic foundations of the country, as it did in many environments before the United States, or if it destroys the watershed, then it would be irresponsible development. So there has to be a balance drawn somewhere between using every cubic inch of water to produce corn and wheat if you can, but making sure that the stream doesn't die in the process.
Yes, question here.
Brandon, what do you think about things like the preservationists, and what do you think about conservation?
Comments on preservationists versus conservationists?
Well, I would agree with Mr. Powell if he had not been stripped of his power and his money by Senator Stewart so that the West could have been developed in an equitable fashion, then maybe Mr. Muir and I would not have to have come out as preservationists. But I was one of the last people to float down the Colorado River before a Glen Canyon Dam was put in and blocked off one of the most beautiful places on earth, one of the places where Mr. Powell got to float. Nobody can float there anymore. And so I think it is to my credit to be called a preservationist, because I wish that such activities would not have occurred, so that it would have been preserved for other people to see instead of just read about.
Could Mr. Muir respond to that too? Is he really, he's been accused of trying to lock everything up?
Mr. Muir on preservationists.
I would not agree that I would like to lock everything up. I would like to enable everyone to experience the opportunity to share in the beauty of nature and to be able to appreciate and understand nature. But with that understanding, it necessitates that we must preserve and conserve the environment in such a way that people can have that opportunity. That may necessitate, by the use of language, locking up or preserving certain national parks or national monuments from the development of the money-hungry people who would like to develop and log and mine and those kinds of things. But I believe fundamentally that people have to be able to experience and renew themselves in nature, which means they have to experience it. And locking up presumes, the way I define it, that it would lock people out of that particular experience, and I wouldn't agree with that at all.
Other questions for any of our panelists? Yes. Mr. Crookham as your mentor and his follow-up.
Well, George Crookham was a 350-pound self-taught abolitionist scientist in Jackson, Ohio, and he took me under his wing to teach me to love books and to believe that reason can sort out the universe and to wander in nature. And I really do credit my entire life's achievement to his mentoring. And as I said earlier today, he was punished for that generosity of spirit by having his barn, his laboratory, burned down by hoodlums during the very difficult period leading up to the Civil War. He was never the same after that. Of course, he continued to be very gracious to all of us, but I think that's a very profound act of terrorism against a man whose whole purpose in life was to help young people blossom into intelligence and good sense and a spirit of adventure. So it's very often the case that our finest people are terrorized in one form or another for their generosity. That troubles me. That troubled me greatly, and the Civil War troubled me even more greatly, that this country conceived on principles of equality and justice could reach the last melancholy state of civil conflagration. I think what happened in the American West following the Civil War has more to do with the Civil War than with greed. I think the Civil War destabilized the country profoundly. I think Mr. Melville would agree with that. I know Walt Whitman would agree with that. And we are, in some regards, you are, in some regards, still recovering from the national loss of character integrity that came from that war.
Yes, in the back there.
Mr. Abby, why do you think The Monkey Wrench Gang was your best-selling book?
Why was The Monkey Wrench Gang your favorite book?
Well, actually, it wasn't my favorite book. Black Sun was. But my best-selling book, I suppose because it was high adventure. Many of my nonfiction books describe the great outdoors and my wonder that I tried to convey to people. And the ideas of preservation came across in the Monkey Wrench Gang. And actually, I was a nonviolent person. All my books had a code of nonviolence. But I could create in the Monkey Wrench Gang a troop of good-natured anarchists that would try to halt the plundering of the West, the development for the sake of a very few rich. And I think that caught on with the spirit of 1975 when it was published.
Yes.
I wonder if Mr. Powell or one of the other panelists would comment on the use of our natural resources for recreation and what kind of advice they would give to the current generation in preserving our water basins going forward.
Okay, comments on use of the public lands for recreation. Mr. Powell?
Well, it's a difficult question because when I went down the Colorado, I was the first person in history who had done it. Certainly the first white person, I think probably the first person of any description. In the time, I'm told that since my time until around 1950, only a few thousands of people followed my path. And suddenly, with the rise of mass media modernity and the enormous wealth of the country in your era, post-World War II, literally tens of thousands and millions of people have gone down that river, and now they are in danger of loving it to death. I still think it's useful, properly managed, scientifically managed, for as many people to make that experiment as possible. In other words, you ask the scientists, this is my leitmotif, ask a scientist, how many people can the Colorado safely carry per year? And then fix the number at that, and don't let the politicians or the corporate moguls have any participation thereafter. Science should always tell us what is a steady state environment and a steady state economy. And if we listen, that does conserve our natural resources. We should only cut down the number of trees that can be replenished by nature. We should, in mining, only mine if we can be assured that the devastation of that mine isn't worth more in the long run than the minerals that we extract. And science will always tell us the answer to these questions. So the purpose of an enlightened society is to listen to the scientists, not to listen to the politicians or the capitalists.
But with all due respect, all you scientists can be bought off by the politicians just like anybody else. And you're going to find a scientist who will testify if the river can take 200,000 when in fact 100,000 is all that should go. And how do we find the, quote unquote right scientist with the right answer that will in fact be a benefit to us and nothing? And it's, when we get bought off, they're going to incite people that think like Mr. Abbey.
Well, first of all, I appreciated what Mr. Abbey said about why terrorism, at least literary terrorism, became necessary. If you don't create conditions of equality and justice, and you do give the country over to the monopolists, at some time you either need a constitutional convention or some selective protest. But I hope that time would never come. How do you know what is a good scientist? Look what we have on this panel. Which of these scientists would you not trust? It seems to me that you find people who bring a high level of integrity to what they do and you listen to them. It's the politicians that I worry about, not the scientists at all. When I presented my Arid Lands report, the scientific community disagreed about some parts of it. Of course, that's the nature of science. But we were in substantial agreement about one thing. If you develop the West before you classify it, you will give it away to the rich. There is no doubt about that question. And why didn't we classify the West before we developed it? We didn't because William Stewart of Nevada and other politicians who were not men of integrity were perfectly willing to destroy one of the world's greatest landscapes to line the pockets of their friends and to continue their own power seeking. I would trust 100 scientists, even if 5 of them are not good ones, rather than 5 politicians.
I think we have time for one more question. Is there one more? Oh, hearing none, then I will thank the panel members, all of them, and thank you, audience, for being here.
Thank you.